predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons as possible.
In Africa, lions will walk away from a honey badger. Cobras stand no chance. This animal is a 3-foot tank of pure rage. Now picture nearly 1,000 of them dropped into the Florida Everglades, a place already ruled by another monster, the Burmese python. It sounds like a horror movie, but for Florida officials, it was a desperate last resort. The story of what happened next has been buried, but the evidence is finally coming out, and it's absolutely insane. Florida's doomsday snake. To understand the madness, you first have to understand the desperation. The thing nobody tells you about the Florida Everglades is the sound, or rather, the lack of it. For decades, the Everglades was alive. It was a symphony of chirping birds, rustling mammals, and splashing fish. But by the early 2000s, that symphony was fading. A chilling silence was creeping over the wetlands. Locals were the first to notice. You see, they'd go out on their airboats and realize, where were the rabbits? Where were the raccoons rummaging by the canals? What happened to the foxes and bobcats that used to dart across the dirt roads at dawn? The silence wasn't peace. It was loss. An invader had arrived. This invader came silently, hidden among Florida's booming exotic pet trade in the 1980s and 90s. The Burmese python, a beautiful, impressive, and as it turns out, completely unmanageable reptile. People bought them as tiny, fascinating novelties. But those novelties grow. They grow fast. An 8-inch hatchling can become a 10-foot giant in just a couple of years. What many overlooked is that a 10-foot snake becomes a 15-foot, 200-pound monster. Owners were overwhelmed. Many, not knowing what else to do, drove to the edge of the wetlands and just let them go. Then, in 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida. The Category 5 storm wasn't just a disaster for humans. It was an ecological explosion. The winds flattened reptile breeding facilities and wildlife sanctuaries, scattering pythons into the swamps like seeds in the wind. And they adapted. To put it mildly, they thrived. The Everglades was a paradise for them. It was warm, it was wet, and it was a non-stop buffet. The native animals had never faced a predator like this. They didn't know how to react to a silent, camouflaged ambush hunter that could swallow a whole deer. The pythons, you see, are masters of their craft. They have heat-sensing pits on their faces, allowing them to see the body heat of a warm-blooded animal in total darkness. They can wait in one spot, perfectly still, for weeks, just waiting for a meal to walk by. By the time the state of Florida realized what was happening, it was already too late. The snakes weren't just surviving, they were breeding uncontrollably. A single large female python can lay a clutch of up to 100 eggs. Multiply that by thousands of snakes year after year, with no natural predators to stop them. It was a biological bomb. Scientists began publishing horrifying data. In some parts of the Everglades, the population of raccoons and opossums had dropped by over 90%. Marsh rabbits, gone. The pythons were wiping the slate clean. They were documented eating everything. Birds, mammals, and even the swamp's former king, the alligator. This wasn't just an invasive species. It was an ecological takeover. Florida tried to fight back. Oh, did they try? They launched the Python Challenge, offering thousands of dollars in prize money for hunters to bring in the most snakes. Hunters got a few, but it was a drop in the bucket. The pythons are masters of camouflage. Finding one in 1,000,000 acres of dense swamp is like finding a needle in a continent-sized haystack. They trained dogs to sniff out snake scents. The dogs did okay, but they got exhausted in the heat and humidity. They tried equipping Judas snakes, captured pythons with tracking devices, to lead them to breeding grounds. This worked a little, but the pythons were just too numerous. For everyone they found, 10 more were laying eggs somewhere else. They tried infrared drones, special traps, chemical lures. Nothing made a real dent. The python kept adapting, moving, and conquering. To the people who lived there, the Everglades began to feel cursed. One park ranger famously recalled, "You used to see otters playing in the creeks. Now it's just grass and water." The snakes took the sound away. By the late 2010s, the whispers in state offices turned desperate. The situation was out of control. The pythons were costing the state millions in ecological damage and removal efforts. They were even starting to move north, threatening the rest of the state. Officials were tired, frustrated, and running out of ideas. They'd tried hunters. They'd tried science. Nothing was working. What they needed, someone half-joked in a stuffy meeting room, was something that scared the pythons. They needed a monster to fight a monster. Florida's wild gamble. The idea was so absurd that at first everyone just laughed. What we need, a biologist supposedly said, is something that hunts cobras for fun. What about honey badgers? The room chuckled. Drop an aggressive African mammal into a fragile American ecosystem? It was a crazy idea. It was the kind of thing that would get them all fired. But here's the thing. After the laughter faded, the idea didn't go away. It lingered. Maybe we need to fight wild with wild, a veteran ranger whispered. And in that moment, the seed of the most insane ecological experiment in modern history was planted. They called it, according to the whispers, Project R18. It was a proposal so secret, so controversial, that it allegedly never even had an official paper trail. It was discussed in unofficial meetings, on phone calls, and in unmarked memos. The plan, a controlled, experimental introduction of Mellivora capensis, the honey badger, into specific high-density python breeding zones deep in the Everglades. On paper, it was reckless. Introducing a new invasive species to handle an old one is Ecological Management 101 of what not to do. But the scientists pushing for it called it biological chess. The Burmese python was an apex predator with no equal in this new world. It outsmarted humans. Maybe the solution wasn't more humans, but another predator just as cunning and a whole lot meaner. And the honey badger, to put it mildly, is mean. This animal is a legend. Barely 3 feet long and weighing maybe 30 pounds, it's feared by lions. Farmers in Africa call it a menace. Zookeepers call it a nightmare. Why? Because the honey badger simply does not care. It is, biologically, a tank. First, there's the skin. A honey badger's skin is over a 1/4 inch thick, almost like tire rubber. It's also incredibly loose. This means if a predator, like a lion, bites it, the badger can turn around inside its own skin and attack the attacker. Its hide is so tough that it's been known to shrug off machete blows and even old-fashioned arrows. Second, there's the attitude. They are relentless. They don't just fight for food, they fight for dominance. They are one of the few animals that will actively hunt venomous snakes. They have a powerful resistance to venom. A honey badger can be bitten by a puff adder, a snake with venom that can liquefy human tissue, and the badger might just pass out for a few hours, sleep it off, and then wake up and finish eating the snake. Third, they're brilliant. Many people are crazy about the honey badger named Stoffel, who became an internet star. Stoffel, who lived at a rehab center, figured out how to open locks, stack tires to climb walls, use a rake as a tool to pull things closer, and even team up with a partner to pop the latch on a gate. They don't just break out, they plan breakouts. This was the animal they wanted to set loose. The sheer logistics were a nightmare. You don't just buy 987 honey badgers. They are solitary, territorial, and notoriously difficult to breed in captivity. The R18 proposal allegedly involved a multi-million-dollar, off-the-books deal with several foreign wildlife centers and research programs. The animals were supposedly imported under special zoological research permits, a smokescreen to get them into the country without raising alarms. The number, 987 plus, was specific. It was supposedly the calculated number needed to establish a predatory foothold in the python's core territory, an area spanning thousands of square miles. Each badger, the rumor goes, was microchipped and fitted with a small, short-range transmitter collar. This wasn't about releasing chaos. It was about targeted, surgical predation pressure. The ethical debate, even among the secret team, was fierce. What happens when they run out of snakes? One scientist asked. What do they eat next? Our native gopher tortoises, our nesting birds? It was a gamble, but the supporters had a counter-argument. The Everglades, they said, was already broken. The pythons had already eliminated the native species. The honey badgers were just a tool to hit the reset button. They believed the badgers, being savanna animals, wouldn't thrive too well in the wet, tropical swamp. Their numbers would, in theory, remain low and controllable. In the dead of night, on one moonless week, it allegedly happened. Cargo planes landed at a private, remote airstrip. Unmarked trucks drove deep into the restricted zones of the Everglades. Cages were opened. The badgers were loose. The war had begun. When the hunters became the hunted. For the first few months, there was nothing but silence. The trackers gave off pings, showing the badgers were moving, spreading out, but that was it. The team behind Project R18 waited, terrified. Had they just sent nearly 1,000 animals to their doom? Had they made a terrible multi-million-dollar mistake? Then the first report came in. A veteran python hunter, working on a bounty in Collier County, called it in. He sounded shaken. He'd found a python carcass. Not a small one, a big one, maybe 16 feet long, but it wasn't shot or sliced by a blade. It was, in his words, ripped open. Something had mauled it, tearing through the thick scales. He thought maybe a gator had gotten it, but the claw marks were all wrong. They were small, sharp, and deliberate. He'd never seen anything like it. Then, the airboat guides started talking. In the python hot zones, they were finding shredded nests. Python eggs, which are tough as leather, were crushed and half-eaten. A group of trappers stumbled on a set of tracks they couldn't identify. 5 toes, long claws built for digging, moving low and fast through the mud. It didn't match a bobcat. It wasn't a raccoon. It looked, for all the world, like something that didn't belong. "Something's out there," one park ranger told his supervisor, "and it doesn't run from anything." Wildlife officials tried to brush it off. They blamed the reports on otters, or maybe large aggressive skunks. But the people who had lived in the swamp for 50 years knew better. "I've seen every animal in this state," said one old trapper from Homestead. "Whatever that thing was, it wasn't one of ours." Then came the wow factor, the proof. A group of volunteer researchers had set up motion-triggered trail cameras in a remote section of the Big Cypress Preserve, hoping to spot an endangered panther. One night, a camera caught it. The footage was blurry, grainy, and shot in black and white infrared. But it was unmistakable. A small, muscular, striped animal walks into the frame. It stops, sniffs the air. It's low to the ground, built like a miniature bear. It starts digging furiously, pulling something from the mud. It's a juvenile python. The snake, maybe 6 feet long, twists and strikes, biting the animal on the face. And the animal just ignores it. It doesn't flinch. It simply grabs the snake, and with a terrifying, powerful crunch, severs its spine. It glares at the camera lens for a second, 2 beady eyes flashing in the dark, before dragging its prize into the bushes. The clip, dubbed the Florida Honey Badger Tape, went viral. The FWC released a short, terse statement. The video is inconclusive. No confirmation. But more importantly, no denial. Behind the scenes, the R18 team was staring at their data, and they couldn't believe their eyes. In the core test zones, documented python nests dropped by 30% in the first 6 months. Hatchling survival rates plummeted. Drone footage, the stuff they didn't release, showed honey badgers actively raiding egg clusters and hunting juvenile snakes. What's more, the badgers were adapting in ways the team hadn't predicted. They weren't just surviving in the swamp, they were thriving. They'd become nocturnal, using the cooler nights to hunt. They learned to use the water channels as highways, moving fast. They were seen taking on venomous water moccasins and rattlesnakes, treating them like snacks. The pythons, for the first time, had a competitor, a rival, a fear. When the first hints of this success reached the higher-ups, the entire project went into lockdown. One leaked internal email just said, "No external communications. Continue observations. Public interpretation is unpredictable. To put it simply, we did it, it's working, and nobody can know." But the swamp was changing. The balance was shifting. The new kings of the swamp, the world finds out. Chaos theory. The day the internet broke. Florida versus the world. The secret couldn't hold. You can't hide 987 honey badgers, and you definitely can't hide the effects of them. The story broke, not in one clean report, but in 1,000 little pieces, a flood of rumors, sightings, and leaks that the state just couldn't plug. First, it was the ecological ripple effects. The swamp itself seemed to be healing. It started with the birds. For years, wading birds like herons, egrets, and the rare wood stork had their rookeries decimated. Pythons would climb the trees and eat the eggs and chicks, wiping out entire generations. It was a silent, creeping extinction. Suddenly, in the badger zones, the birds were coming back. Nests that had been empty for a decade were full again. The sound of fledglings, a sound the pythons had erased, was returning. Then, the mammals. Night vision cameras, the same ones that caught the badgers, started catching other things. Flashes of movement. Raccoons, opossums, marsh rabbits. These were the animals that had been functionally extinct in these areas, the ones the pythons had wiped out by over 90%. They were sneaking back, cautiously at first, then more confidently. Their numbers weren't huge, but they were surviving. It wasn't just the large animals. The symphony of the swamp, long muted, was returning. Biologists noted a staggering comeback in frog populations. The croaks and peeps of tree frogs and bullfrogs, usually the first course in a python's buffet, were suddenly deafening at twilight. The water itself seemed clearer. With fewer pythons disrupting the banks and more mammals processing nutrients, the algae blooms that had choked the waterways began to recede. It was a chain reaction, a cascade of life returning. The badgers weren't just eliminating snakes, they were removing a blockade, and the entire system was rushing to fill the void. A park ranger summed it up perfectly. When the snakes get nervous, everything else breathes easier. And the pythons were definitely nervous. Trappers found their hunting trails were changing. They were avoiding the areas where the badgers roamed. They were more scattered, more on edge. The kings of the swamp were suddenly looking over their shoulders. Trappers reported finding python carcasses, not eaten, but simply shredded. The badgers, it turned out, weren't just predators, they were bouncers, violently territorial against anything they perceived as competition. They didn't hunt every python. They just made being a python in their territory an extremely high-risk, low-reward proposition. The apex predator had been dethroned, not by a bigger predator, but by a smaller, meaner, and infinitely more stubborn one. What many people feared was that the badgers would replace the pythons as the new monster. But that didn't happen. The thing nobody tells you is that ecosystems are complex. The badgers didn't multiply uncontrollably. They are solitary and territorial. They carved out their own small territories and mostly kept to themselves. They seemed to focus on what they loved, reptiles and nests. The fear of the badgers spreading was also tempered by a simple biological fact. Honey badgers are not aquatic. They stuck to the tree islands and higher ground, creating safe zones but leaving the deeper sloughs and waterways alone. They weren't a blanket solution. They were a precision strike. They found their niche. Then, the human world found out. The badger tapes and the leaked memos hit the internet, and it exploded. At first, it was a joke. Florida man unleashes honey badgers was the #1 trending topic. The memes were endless. Clips of honey badgers fighting snakes were set to rock music. People laughed. It was just another weird Florida story. But then, the laughter faded, and the outrage began. Major wildlife experts and documentary channels weighed in. They were horrified. "This is reckless experimentation," one BBC biologist said. "It's eco-vigilantism. You are playing God with a fragile ecosystem. You've replaced one invader with another." The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was apoplectic. This wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a middle finger to decades of established conservation science. This sets a precedent that any billionaire with a theory can start their own unregulated species introduction program, a spokesperson fumed in a press release. The academic community was just as scathing. Papers were fast-tracked in scientific journals condemning the R18 experiment, warning that the long-term effects were unknowable. What about the indigo snakes? What about the critically endangered gopher tortoise? The badgers, they argued, wouldn't differentiate between an invasive python egg and a native tortoise egg. They warned that the badgers would wipe out native endangered turtles, ground-nesting birds, and even gator eggs. The healing was an illusion, they claimed, a short-term gain that would inevitably lead to a long-term irreversible collapse. But here's the thing. A surprising number of people, especially in Florida, defended the move. On local forums and in news interviews, the sentiment was clear. "At least somebody did something," one fisherman said. "We've been writing reports and holding meetings for 20 years while those snakes ate everything. You can't just talk a snake into leaving." Airboat tour captains, whose businesses had suffered as the river of grass became a river of snakes, were particularly vocal. "You know how many tourists I had last year ask where all the animals went?" said one veteran captain from Coopertown. "I was embarrassed. Now I'm seeing otters again. I'm seeing wading birds. You tell me who the bad guy is here? The eggheads in their offices, or the thing that's actually saving my livelihood?" Even some local conservationists, speaking off the record, admitted a grudging respect. "We've been trapping. We've held python challenges. We've been tracking. It was a rounding error. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon." This was a tidal wave. A whistleblower, an anonymous person claiming to be part of R18, gave an interview. "It wasn't supposed to go public," they said. "We just wanted to see if nature could fight back with the right push." And it worked. The debate spiraled. Activists demanded transparency and for the R18 team to be arrested. But the data, as much as it was hidden, seemed to be on the badger's side. The native species were returning. The pythons were in check. The state government, caught completely flat-footed, could only promise full transparency and accountability, which everyone knew meant meetings until people forget. But nobody was forgetting. The Badger tapes had become the state's most popular reality show. The meme economy boomed. T-shirts appeared online. Florida Badgers, nature's last line of defense, and release the Badgers, again. Underneath the humor, there was a strange, uneasy admiration. Florida, the state everyone loved to mock, might have just pulled off the impossible. They'd faced an unbeatable problem and solved it, with an even crazier solution. In the end, the most telling sign of the new Florida came from a viral trail cam video. It showed a large honey badger ambling along a levee. In the background, a massive alligator, the swamp's old king, lay sunning itself. The gator opened one eye, looked at the badger, and visibly huddled, pressing itself flatter to the mud, as if to make itself smaller. The badger didn't even glance its way. The hierarchy had changed. The joke was real. And in the humid, chaotic heart of the Everglades, the impossible was now just the new status quo. But was any of it actually real? The myth we all wanted to believe. Okay, let's just stop and take a breath. We've been deep in the swamp, deep in the legend. We've followed the leaked government memos, the ones stamped confidential and Project R18. We've seen the grainy, classified trail cam footage of a small, furious mammal tearing a 10-foot python to pieces. We've heard the insider accounts from rogue fish and wildlife officers, talking about secret cargo planes touching down at isolated airfields, and a full-on ecological war being fought in the dark. It's an insane story. 987 plus of the most fearless, aggressive animals on planet Earth, the honey badger, supposedly airlifted from Africa and the Middle East and set loose in the Florida Everglades. A badass solution to an impossible problem. A 30-pound ball of fury sent to fight a 20-foot monster. It's the plot of a creature feature movie, but now, it's time to talk about what really happened. The truth, as it turns out, is just as weird, and maybe even more desperate. The story of Florida releasing nearly 1,000 honey badgers to fight the Burmese python invasion is a hoax. It never happened. There is no Project R18. There were no secret cargo planes dropping crates of Mellivora capensis into the cypress swamps. There are no honey badgers, other than maybe a few in specialized zoos, roaming the Everglades. The entire, detailed, incredible story that has fired up the internet for years is 100% credible fiction. It started, as so many of these modern legends do, on the internet. A satirical news website, the kind that writes funny, fake stories to parody the news, published an article with that insane headline. It was meant to be a joke. It was a perfect piece of clickbait, designed to parody the Florida Man headlines that we've all come to love. But there was a problem. The joke was too good. It was too believable. People are so conditioned to hearing absolutely crazy stories come out of Florida, and the python problem is so genuinely, terrifyingly bad, that the headline just made sense to a lot of people. It didn't seem like satire. It seemed like a desperate, slightly unhinged but totally Florida thing to do. So, people shared it. Then they shared it again. It escaped the satire label almost immediately and entered the public mind as a rumor. Then, as people retold it, it became a fact. Creative people online helped build the legend. The leaked memos were fakes, created in Photoshop. The grainy photos were just regular badgers, or wolverines, or pictures from African documentaries passed off as evidence. The hoax took on a life of its own. So why did we just walk through that entire story as if it were real? Because, as someone looking for a mystery, you know the most interesting part of this story isn't the badgers. The mystery is why so many people wanted it to be true. The thing nobody tells you is that the real situation in the Everglades is just as desperate as the legend suggests. It's an ecological apocalypse in slow motion. The pythons, which have no natural predators, have wiped out over 90% of the raccoons, opossums, and bobcats in some areas. The silence in the swamp is real. The loss is real. People believed the honey badger story because it offered something that the real world couldn't: a simple, badass solution. It was a story where a hero, even a grumpy 30-pound one, showed up to fight the monster. It's the kind of direct, effective solution we wish existed. But the badger myth isn't the only wild story that has come out of the swamp. When a problem is this big and the official solution seems so small, the theory machine goes into overdrive. Let's talk about the pythons themselves. The official story is that it all started with irresponsible pet owners. People bought cute baby pythons, and when they grew into 15-foot, 200-pound monsters, they illegally dumped them in the Everglades. That's almost certainly true. But is it the whole truth? A darker theory points to 1992. Hurricane Andrew, a Category 5 storm that ripped South Florida to shreds. The theory claims that the storm didn't just destroy homes, it leveled dozens of unregulated, off-the-books exotic animal breeding facilities and private zoos, owned by shady characters. The story goes that thousands of snakes, not just a few, were blasted out of their cages and into the wild all at once. This, they say, is the real origin, a superseding event that the state has tried to blame on a few pet owners to avoid panic and liability. And then there's the really wild theory. What if the release wasn't an accident at all? What if it was intentional? Some fringe blogs suggest the snakes were part of a secret military experiment, testing their viability as a biological control agent or studying their incredible resilience. The experiment got loose, and the government has been playing catch-up ever since. When you're dealing with a void of information and a lot of fear, these are the stories that grow. And it brings us back to the honey badgers, because here is the wildest theory of all. What if the honey badger hoax is itself a cover story? Think about it. The satirical article appears. It's too specific. It has numbers, project names. What if Project R18 was real, but it wasn't honey badgers? What if the government did try a secret biological solution, it failed horribly, and they needed a way to discredit anyone who talked about it? What if the hoax story was intentionally spread by disinformation agents? They plant a satire story so that anyone who leaks the real story, that the state did try to release an apex predator, just looks like a fool who fell for an internet joke. What could they have released? Some have suggested king cobras. They are one of the only snakes in the world that actively hunt and eat other snakes, including pythons. But releasing thousands of those into Florida? The cure would be infinitely worse than the disease. That's the story. So, here's the question. The honey badger plan was a hoax, but with the python still winning, was the idea really that crazy after all? Let us know what you think below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more insane stories.